Hi there, and welcome to the Anita Chat podcast. I'm your host, Anita Rombo, and this is the podcast for growth-oriented women to have authentic, real talk. Nothing is off the table here, but as an intuitive self-relationship coach, you'll find the content gravitates towards mindset, intentional action, spirituality, and all things wellness. So if you're ready to learn, laugh, show up, and glow up to be the best version of yourself, grab your favorite bevy, settle in, and we've got lots to chat about.
Welcome to another episode of Anita Chat. I am so excited to introduce you today to a guest on our show, Dr. Dara Abraham, a Philadelphia-based psychiatrist on a mission to transform lives impacted by adult ADHD. With personal experience and 15 years of expertise, Dr. Abraham creates tailored evaluations and treatments that help individuals with ADHD thrive. Dara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited that you're here with us. Can you start with your sharing your own story with us, especially around your own experiences with ADHD?
Yes, of course. So just to, give you some context, I have always done extremely well in school, academically, socially. I've had a group of friends since grade school or earlier. And, my parents always thought of me as the easy child, compared to my brother who had, he's super intelligent these days, but had a learning disorder himself, had dyslexia. And then my sister who was the artist. And I was that middle child who was extremely academic, almost pulling all-nighters before, an exam in middle school. But, that wasn't normal to be that worried about an exam. And the amount of effort and time that went into my preparations of schoolwork was just not on par with, how much I seemed like I was picking up or, my intelligence. But I didn't really think anything of it. I was always pretty talkative. I would always get, comments on my report card, then I would basically shut up. And, this was ongoing. But, I always just felt like I just had to work hard. I didn't know that anything was really wrong. I always had anxiety. So that actually compensated for a lot of the symptoms and made me mask a lot of the underlying ADHD symptoms. And I thought I was, to be quite frank, I thought I was kind of just flaky and ditzy and, like my father used to joke around or still does, sort of just book smart. And so all of these things can obviously, even in a joking manner, can lead to definitely some shame, some guilt, and poor self-esteem. And so little by little, I, still, trugged along and I went to, I was pre-med in undergrad and then I struggled, but I got through all my pre-med courses. I took some time off and then I was floundering, but I knew I was going to go to medical school. And somehow I got through medical school, but it was probably the hardest few years of my life. But really the main reason of not really understanding how to study, how to absorb information, how to really sustain attention long enough, even when I was interested in that movie, that novel, that book, that conversation. And so I think just due to some performance anxiety with tests, I was seeing a psychologist and then I was evaluated by a psychiatrist and one of my first experiences, they had mentioned the idea of ADHD and asking me about family history. And at that point I was like, no, I have no family history. I don't even know what you're discussing. I'm here for anxiety, for test, performance anxiety. And I walked out just kind of brushing it off like they didn't really know me. So fast forward a couple years down the line, and I was finishing up my psychiatry residency. And I remember being an outpatient doing psychotherapy as a third year. And I just was really shocked by how many, especially females, adults were not responding to any of the medication. Like it wasn't even just my first choice, it's my second, my third. And they all seemed to have the same characteristic of just really a great work ethic, but socially anxious and just perfectionistic. And there just was this underlying theme. And, a lot of times this was chalked up maybe by a higher up psychiatrist who was my superior of maybe a personality disorder. And that does get, misconstrued as personality pathology, or, a lot of the flaws that an ADHD folks have can come off as being almost arrogant, or they also can come off, if they're very hyperactive, being almost what we call, hypomanic. And so little by little, I finally just realized it was more. And that's when I started to think about this idea of some developmental disorder. And at the same time, I ended up starting to see a psychologist and another psychiatrist just for, anxiety. And because that's what you do when you're a psych resident, you stay in therapy for your whole entire life. And so I ended up finally confirming that I truly did have ADHD, but wasn't really, I thought of it now as adult ADHD since it presents very differently. And, you know, from then on, I completely, even without medicine or therapy or coaching, I really just changed my outlook of myself. And I started to really think of it as this is part of my ADHD, not making excuses, but this is, I accept all of me. And I really think that just knowing that you have a different brain and that your chemistry is different, not meaning that you can't work on those differences that you don't like, really allowed me to really, thrive. And so that's what I want to do for others.
That is such a wonderful mission.
Yeah.
And I have to say, we are actually able to view each other for those of us tuning in. And, you saw me smiling. And the reason I'm smiling is because I have been told by other people that have ADHD that they think I have ADHD. And in listening to your description of your childhood, adolescence, all of that kind of stuff, it sounds just very similar to mine. So I'm feeling like, yes, I've always been that perfectionistic, very anxious, very hardworking, probably more than required. And definitely the results sometimes didn't always reflect the amount of effort that I've put in. So, and I do know that, and this could also just be, I don't know, a sign of growing older, but
Yeah.
when you have kids, my attention span, you've got to be quick and to the point, or I got to move on to the next thing. And so I don't know if that's part of that diagnosis. But just seeing a lot of what you're saying, I feel like it resonates with me, and I'm like, maybe I need to get something looked at here.
I mean, well, it's so interesting because, with that said, ADHD is not a pathology in the sense like anxiety or depression is. It really is, a range of normal symptoms that when you combine them all and you have enough of them, they affect enough areas of your life is when you have a disorder. And so I think there's many folks out there who do have, ADHD symptoms, but not the disorder. But then I also think there's millions of people out there who have a lot of the symptoms and the disorder that are undiagnosed, especially women of, childbearing years who also have some anxiety and who come from a very, very nurturing upbringing and really had maybe some structure until things maybe, kind of are spread too thin, like they have too many responsibilities, it's really hard to crack them. They really don't you don't really see anything. And even then, I don't know if anyone would have been able to really pick up on it from an outsider, even during medical school when I was beyond cracked. I was in pieces. But
The
yeah.
other interesting thing too is, I mean, growing up, I associated and continue to potentially associate up until like very recently, a year ago, I would say, or two, ADHD as a disorder or a condition that affects young boys. It's very like just up until a couple of years ago, very few people that I knew, especially women, were diagnosed with it. And so I feel like there's been all of a sudden once, I don't know if it's a confirmation bias, like now that I'm aware of it, I'm seeing it everywhere, but it just does seem that it's kind of now almost a buzzword. And so many women in my circle or people that I'm aware of have it.
Yeah. And it goes, there's a double-edged sword with that. I think that due to the fact that it's a buzzword, it's allowed a lot of people to reach out for help. It's allowed a lot of, people in the field to really get more educated on adult ADHD and that it can be seen in adult women, that actually it doesn't go away. At least 90% of folks end up still having it as an adult in some way, shape, or form. But, it also, it does a disservice where, it's kind of, marginalized as, everyone has it. Everyone's getting diagnosed. But in reality, there's still more people that are undiagnosed than diagnosed. Are there some that are maybe misdiagnosed? Yeah, but along with every other field of medicine, including psychiatry, you have misdiagnoses all the time. But I will say that, you know, that in the past 3 years, there's been a statistics of at least, I think it was like between like around 22% increase in new diagnoses. And if you break it down, it's mostly, women between the ages of 35 and 45 who have been getting these diagnoses, and they've had the symptoms. They didn't just acquire this overnight, but finally things just came to a halt. I mean, I did have a lot of help, a village, but had to basically work from home, take care of my kids, take care of a house, make sure that someone was there to, come in and supervise. I mean, I know the pandemic days are behind us, but if you think about it, that all came at once. And then there was this anxiety that was so much uncertainty and anxiety that maybe these women had always lived with. It was a new type of anxiety. It was uncertainty about the future, their health, their family's health, not just uncertainty about, what there's going to be at the grocery store and if they're going to have enough vegetables that they're going to pick up. So I think that all of this led to a breakdown of their normal coping skills and what probably, if you do have ADHD, what you use on a daily basis.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
when we're talking about it being reflected more so in women these days, and for very good reason, you outlined so many different pressures that are new to us or came in a more amplified form in the last couple of years. How does ADHD manifest in women?
Yeah. So it manifests basically the same way as it does in adult men. It's just that when we think of ADHD, we think of it more as a childhood, young, little boy disorder where they mostly had the hyperactivity and the impulsivity.
Mm-hmm.
That is a part of the disorder. It's also the inattentiveness. So for an adult, including men, usually it is more inattentive symptoms. And a lot of that hyperactivity and impulsivity is still there. They haven't completely outgrown it, but it's more internal. It's more mental restlessness. It's more feeling fidgety internally, sometimes outwardly, externally. It's maybe being on the go. Insomnia. 80% of adults with ADHD have some form of sleep-wake dysfunction, trouble falling asleep. They're considered night owls, trouble waking up. They get their deepest sleep right before it's time to get up. Maybe some restless leg syndrome, also just some, issues in terms of being a light sleeper. So all of this can, manifest as just because ADHD doesn't stop, after a work day, after a school day, it continues while you're sleeping. And so that hyperactivity manifests that way. I think for females, the difference is that, in societal expectations of us, as much as, we don't want to believe it, there still is this idea that, women are, children, little girls are really taught to be polite, to make sure that they have everything together. Their identity is a little bit more based on having a nice notebook and an organized, book bag and all of that stuff. And so there's a lot of pressure to kind of make things look okay and to mask any, you know, any deficit. And so I think that a lot of the ADHD manifests in women when after they have children, after they go away to college, when they have less structure, when they have too many responsibilities and they no longer can mask, they're just not able to. And so you start to see things fall through the cracks. It all, just like remembering appointments, remembering doctor's appointments for your whole family, not just yourself, kind of having to live by a planner more than you used to. Maybe before it was just to-do list every room, but now it's kind of all those adulting skills that are really hard. And also, I notice it a lot in females as well that are going through, some other life changes, such as retirement or, menopause. There's also some hormonal changes that happen during that time, but also retirement when they don't have, I have folks who come to me really, kind of almost thinking they have new onset dementia. But it's always been there. They've always had this very functional, type of ADHD that maybe, was misdiagnosed as just anxiety, even though they had the anxiety too, but they just, when they retire, they no longer have structure. So they don't have to keep the normal hours that they used to. And so left to your own devices, an ADHD brain, without accountability will not have as much self-regulation. Usually there are some, if you really let go of all of that external pressure.
So how would somebody self-regulate, or what are some strategies for somebody with ADHD to self-regulate?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, I always try to get folks to really get others involved. So accountability. I mean, accountability can just mean that you let a friend know that you're going to start going to the gym. Even if I said it to one person that I'm going to start going to the gym or use one of my exercise equipment that I've had here in the house for a couple of years, most likely someone may ask me about it. So subconsciously, I'll probably want to at least do it once or twice. Also teaming up with someone, there is a phenomenon that is called body doubling. And it's so useful for ADHD adults, but it's also useful for ADHD adolescents. It's why that group work is really helpful. But basically what it is just having someone there while you're doing something that's hard, like that just requires sustained attention. There's actually online body doubling groups where you can just be partnered with others. And so it's much easier, it's much harder to become distracted and start going on social media when there's someone out there who can see that, even if it's not someone that's doing the same thing as you. Also really, just structuring your day. So actually timing out, planning out your day in a way where you have designated time for personal time, for self-care, for time to reconnect with friends, for family. And that way you're not saving it all for just one day of the week or just 1 hour of the day. And that way you're a little less likely to just procrastinate and put things off, which is a big thing for ADHD adults, adolescents, and for many people. But I think if you have more structure and more accountability on your own, you actually give yourself a sense of urgency. So if you actually put more in your calendar, even if it's just recording a podcast, and yes, that's something, but you could have that equivalent to cleaning out your closet. It's easier to break the appointment of the closet with yourself. But when it's on your schedule and then you're trying to do something else, like put off maybe getting some work documentation done, if you look at it and you externalize it and you can see it on I always say holding it is a little bit more tangible, but it can be, a iPhone app. But you're less likely to say, oh, I can just do it tomorrow, right? Since that's the lie that we tell ourselves with ADHD, and I'm, very good at them. But, not externalizing the time, and that's key for how to self-regulate, really actually putting out exactly what it is that you want done. If you have an intention in the morning to, make a new recipe, most likely one of the executive functions that ADHD adults suffer from is working memory. So that thought may go out of your brain and you may never get it until the next day. Or it may come back, but you may come back at 11 p.m. at night when you're trying to go to sleep. And so if you really externalize it, meaning write it down, put it on a sticky note, there's reason why you always want to write everything down when you have ADHD. It's because it doesn't stay in the brain long enough and you're going to forget it. And that can lead to anxiety. And that's why these two go hand in hand.
Oh my God. The more I'm talking to you, I'm like, I know it. If you see me, I'm surrounded by sticky notes everywhere. And I live and die by my full focus planner. And that's not just the one planner. I also have cajillion to-do lists on my phone, one for the weekend, one for, every minute of my day is structured and accounted for.
Yes. And so you have, let's just say, I'm not obviously diagnosing you, but a lot of people can just really master the skills, the executive like skill training that actually many get taught in group therapy or with a coach. And it doesn't mean that it's not hard. It doesn't take some extra energy and time, but basically there's ways that you have accommodated. But when I tell people that that's not normal, meaning not everyone has to do that to manage themselves, they're shocked. Another thing that adult with ADHD is shocked to hear is when I tell them that when I ask the question of, do you ever have a time throughout the day, not when you're sleeping, but the day when you don't have at least one thought in your brain? And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, just no thoughts, just empty. They're like, you're telling me other people will sit there like, at noon, not like 1 a.m. with nothing in their brain, not thinking about anything. I'm like, yep. And they're just shocked by that. They can't get over the fact that that actually,
I didn't know that
occurs.
exists either. I've
Yeah.
always just thought, even when I'm meditating, which I do every day, every morning,
That's
there's still a million thoughts going through my mind, and it's more just being aware of it rather than, controlling them. So
Of course, which,
really
yeah.
eye-opening. This is so interesting.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're doing everything that even if you had ADHD, everything that you should be
Self-diagnosed.
doing. Yes, right? Because I mean, mindfulness meditation for an ADHD brain is so powerful. And when I say like, I don't know how long you do it every day, but even a couple minutes is all that's necessary, which is the
20
self-regulation. Yeah.
I've been doing this since I was 7 years old. I actually taught myself to meditate when I was 7. So that's
Wow.
something that's yeah. Fun
Oh my
fact.
God. Yeah.
So you talked about something too, and I was like, oh my God, we need to go back to this as well. And so again, my
Yes.
mind is like, don't lose that thought.
Yep. Of
The
course.
working
Of
memory
course.
is gonna leave me. We
Mhm.
talked about hormones. And so I mean, I'm at that time where I'm kind of going through the change. And so I'm curious to know about that connection of it with ADHD and hormones and how hormones
Yes.
impact cycles and
Yes. So there is a direct relationship with. We'll really just focus on females, even though it would affect males too. Testosterone is a sex hormone, estrogen is a sex hormone, progesterone. But with the female, we notice a few things. Their symptoms actually start later than boys, since even the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, since the testosterone that happens you know, let's just say an ADHD boy has ADHD symptoms, then goes through puberty, the testosterone actually makes the ADHD symptoms worse. It actually decreases something called dopamine, which is what an ADHD brain is deficient in. And it controls many pathways in the brain that are ADHD symptoms, working memory, or the ability to focus, to the impulsivity, all that good stuff. And so during puberty actually is when boys will actually need medication adjustment. It's not based on weight. It's not based on height. It's not like all of that is a myth. It's really just based on how your brain is changing and how the hormonal, um, changes that happen in different stages of life affect your brain. So what happens with testosterone is that it decreases that good, neurotransmitter dopamine. The opposite is true with females. Estrogen actually, when every month when you ovulate, your estrogen peaks. But there are also other times where people have a change in their sex hormones between estrogen and progesterone. But whenever you have, and this varies, but usually it's somewhat cyclical. But usually when the estrogen is higher relative to the progesterone and the other sex hormone, testosterone, since women have that as well, you actually have elevated, it helps to surge and basically elevate that level of dopamine. And so a lot of people, this is not proven. I don't even know if there's studies, but even during pregnancy, a lot of women will say that they feel good, that their cognition was fine. If anything, their memory was better. Maybe not the second pregnancy, but at least the first, that they didn't have that brain fog. But then, when they deliver and that mommy brain, that never goes away. And so that decrease in estrogen is so much more obvious to them after you give birth and when you just plummets, just like, and you also have it, and that also is directly related to something called serotonin, which also can affect your level of anxiety or irritability or moodiness. So estrogen is a good thing. And so during puberty, actually, some of the ADHD symptoms are improved, especially when your estrogen is high. And then, every cycle, depending on if you have a regular cycle or whatnot. But what happens during perimenopause? So menopause isn't just a week thing and you're done. It can be a couple years, it can be 10 years for some. And so that's the part that is very that's the part that's very obvious and can be very, you know, someone can really notice, and that's when they start to struggle. And what happens is, if someone hasn't been diagnosed with ADHD, it's even the scariest, since they really will start to notice some cognitive changes and just brain fog and just feel like they have no working memory. But when I really sit down with them, it's not memory where we think of there's different types of memory. It's really that working memory, which, just to make it more clear and just to simplify it, working memory is basically part of the short-term memory. And so we have two different types. We have the visual working memory and we have the auditory. Usually an ADHD brain will have issues with both, but sometimes they'll have one that's better, one that's great. And so that's the ability to hold on to information that you were to give me and store it there, maybe directions. So auditory directions. And I had to store it in my head. And then I had to take those directions and then drive to New York City. I mean, I can't get down the street with Waze or Google Map. I still can't get down the street. So that would be hard. But, basically when you go through perimenopause, your estrogen is decreasing relative to the other sex hormones. And that slowly happens. That can be much quicker. Some women are very sensitive to the change. So it's not the amount of hormones. Everyone's always saying, can I check my hormones? Can I do this? But it's really based on the sensitivity to the change. And so really it's just, coming up with ways to maybe eat healthier, to add some phytoestrogen or whatever it is, some, folic acid or some, over-the-counter nutrients to help with some of that. Also being mindful that this is all normal and that no, you're not having some significant cognitive decline. It's just that once you have to regulate again, and basically once that it's the change that's really occurring. So once your estrogen is low and you're past, lower than it was, and you're past that perimenopause and considering menopause, usually women actually feel better. And so,
God.
yeah, I mean, not perfect. It's always going to be lower, but better.
I'm definitely in that. Like everything you're saying again, just super resonant. So.
I mean, yeah. So that's why I always say I always say it's never too late to be diagnosed. Doesn't mean we're going to treat it with medicines or even coaching or therapy, but just the recognition of it is so helpful.
Well, even talking to you has put my mind at ease, because honestly, it's like a running joke in our home about how poor my memory is. Like that's nonstop every day here from my kids. And I used to have a great memory. So I'm just like, what's happened to me? And part of it could be all the stuff that we had to deal with over the last couple of years. And to your point, like I'm okay managing my stuff. It just gets to be too much when it's about a whole house, this career, a corporate career, there's just a lot. There's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot.
So what is something about your ADHD that you've learned to love and embrace? I mean, you've also been through this, and this is kind of cool.
Yeah. So I think the one thing, and I love it, I have like a love-hate relationship with, is that I love that I will, I'll jump in. One thing I want to mention before I mention this is the hyper focus. So ADHD is not what people think. There's so many misnomers and just misunderstandings of it. And really, it's not lack of attention. It's inconsistent attention. So you can have hyper focus or no focus. You can have hyperactivity or no activity. You can have, meaning just not motivated to do anything. And you can have hyper emotional, very emotionally like dysregulated, or having trouble emoting. And this can change in a matter of a day. Some people will err on more one side or the other, but basically I definitely get into these hyper focused modes where I will do things very thoroughly. I will decide that that I can make my website, that I can make an app, that I can just play around and do stuff. And I love that side of me where I'll just get focused and I'll want to just solve problems and I'll do it for myself, for my loved ones, or even my patients. And so I love that I can be so detail oriented and so hyper focused and literally not go to the bathroom or, have a sip of water for hours. Because I really come up with new creative, great things. But I hate it always, it usually leads to feeling there's a point where of no return, where I'm just so annoyed that why did I spend that couple of hours rewriting something when I could have been with my child who's going to be, a teenager before I know it. And so I think that's where I struggle, where, I think what happens in that hyper focus, since it is a symptom, it's just one dopamine surge after another. And so we have to be mindful that even if those dopamine surges are fueling maybe our business or our creativity, we need to make sure that they align with our, long-term goals and priorities in life.
Oh, that's really deep. That's really,
Yeah.
really deep. Because again, I think of where I feel I'm assuming a lot of dopamine hits is my
Yep.
business, right? Because I'm a new entrepreneur, newish, a year or so in the making. Um, everything is learned from scratch and just a lot of
Exactly.
time, effort, and it's so validating. It just feels so good to like figure something out, or like I'm so proud of all of my progress, and that's what motivates me to keep going. Plus, that I have this vision and I really want to create impact in a certain way. But you're right. Like sometimes, like my website, for example, 3 weeks, I didn't get up like from the couch, like 8 o'clock to 8 p.m. I just sat there and and just was at it. And I didn't even notice. It didn't feel like work because it was so much fun for me.
It's enjoyable.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's what a lot of adults with ADHD, especially women, but a lot of adults are validation seekers. And so, the things that are going to feel validating are, things that actually are really helpful to motivate an ADHD brain. And that's something that's challenging. That's something new and novel. That's something that maybe a competitiveness, even with yourself, that you never thought you could do. And then the last thing is a sense of urgency. So if you have like a couple hours to get something done or to help someone, you can pack up that apartment like no other or do whatever it is because there's a time frame. It's not like you can put it off. And so those things are really going to be helpful if you have adult ADHD and you somehow manipulate your life and your daily tasks to have something new, novel. Of course, you can't get a new job, a new partner every day, a new kid. Wouldn't that be nice? But no, not the kid, but a new job. But in terms of that newness and then challenge, if you can, not challenge, not too much of a challenge, but enough of a challenge that you feel stimulated. And obviously I think what folks really rely on the most is the urgency. And that's why there's so much procrastination. They're waiting for this moment where they're going to feel in the mood. And that's another lie that we tell ourselves, since that moment is not coming. It's what's going to come is that there's this deadline and the clock is ticking. And so a lot of times the reason that ADHD people don't do the things they need to do is that it's based on emotion, meaning I don't want to do that. I'm not in the mood, or I shouldn't start that because it's not going to be good enough, or what's the point of going down that, or I need more time to go there. So if we could take the emotions out of it, there'd be a lot less issue in terms of regulating your time and your effort.
So I'm going to ask 2 questions and I think we'll wrap this up. But first question is, when we're taking a look at women in particular, so women in this kind of phase of life that we're in, what are some of the symptoms? Like you mentioned that people may have symptoms, but they may not actually have ADHD. So what are some of the symptoms that they could look out for? So that's number one. And then number two is, how do they go about finding out if they do have ADHD? And if they do, what can they do to change their life? Like that may not necessarily be medication management.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. So, number one, just to give you a short understanding, there's 3 different types of core symptoms of ADHD. We have the inattentive, we have the hyperactive and impulsive. So for the inattentive, these are the ones that I would want someone to look out for. Forgetfulness, not just with one thing, but just all the time, forgetting their belongings, their keys, leaving the door open, of and on. Um, just inability to sustain focus with multiple things. When I say sustain focus, at least a half hour or longer. Maybe things that they enjoy, even a movie, having trouble finishing a book, things like that. Also, motivation. People don't realize that motivation is an inattentive symptom. So just having inconsistent motivation, especially for things that are a little more mundane and boring and not really exciting. Also, boredom, that is an inattentive symptom. So feeling the need to always be stimulated. Um, and then also we have the impulsivity, which for women, I would say, I always think about, impulsively saying something that is hurtful to your spouse or your mom, or impulsively, blurting something out that you wish you didn't say, kind of no filter. And then the hyperactivity, which is that mental restlessness, almost what gets misdiagnosed, even though the anxiety doesn't exist, it's only anxiety. And so those are the big things. And then we have those are the core symptoms, but then the executive dysfunction, that's the area of the brain. And we use this interchangeably with adult ADHD core symptoms, but it is separate. But 90% of adults, I would say, have a significant ADHD executive dysfunction. And so those are working memory trouble, like organization, planning, prioritizing. And so really, if you have difficulties with these core symptoms, at least, 9 or so altogether, if you take a look at some of the breakdown of the symptoms, and then also have issues with some of the working memory, organization, planning, prioritizing, that's when you definitely want to reach out and, see if you can at least talk to your primary care physician. If they're not well educated on this, then you can always reach out to a psychiatrist. It's a little bit harder to find one these days, especially that takes your insurance. It's also hard to find someone that, that knows enough, that is well versed and well educated on, adult ADHD, who's going to give you the type of assessment you need. That said, really, it's a clinical diagnosis. So if I were to sit here with you for, 2.5 hours and go through your whole, not 2 hours, I usually spend your whole childhood, your academic career, your social history, your family history, it's very genetic, even the undiagnosed symptoms in your parents or someone. And then, also talk to a spouse or a mother, father, and then maybe look at some stuff if someone's young enough and they have some documentation from school, grad school, then I can have a complete picture and make a diagnosis without any test, without any neuropsych eval. There is a time and a place for one of those expensive neuropsych evals. Usually it's more children or adolescents. But, it really is based on a clinical diagnosis, which is just talking with the patient. And so the types of treatment besides, the first line treatment is medication and it is stimulants. And I think there's always a pause because it's a controlled substance. But, besides that, there is very evidence-based, effective, what's called cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD. And it is really effective, especially remember, if you're getting diagnosed as an adult, you most likely have more mild to moderate symptoms. And you've also most likely already incorporated a lot of those executive skills training and cognitive behavioral skills that you need. So it just you may just need a tune up. I even suggest always looking into group therapy type of ADHD programs, since you really learn a lot by hearing other stories and just by working together and solidifying some of the behaviors. And then also just some natural, really talking to an integrative doctor about some maybe natural supplements that can really help, or some nutrition-based changes in your diet and exercise. The number one evidence-based treatment that's not medication to increase your dopamine is exercise and incorporating cardiovascular.
This has been so enlightening. I have just really enjoyed this conversation.
I'm
Thank
so
you so
glad.
much for coming on the show. Now, before we sign off, is there one last nugget or anything, a take-home message that you want to leave the listeners with?
So I really think that if you feel like any of this resonates you, that it's really important to reach out for care and for an assessment, and don't take no for an answer. Don't be ridiculed. Don't feel like, just keep advocating for yourself. And you know yourself best. I always say, I know meds best. I know psychiatry best, but you know yourself best. You know your brain, and you're actually the one. I can't do any type of formal test on you. The test is really talking with you and getting the information. And so I think if you don't find someone like that to collaborate with, then you want to move on and advocate.
Really good point. And I think it's
Yeah.
just wonderful that you have learned to embrace that and make that your full identity. And you're living a full, rich life, and you know how to compensate for those things where there's a gap. And I think that that's all of us, right? Like we all have our strengths
Yes.
and weaknesses. There's absolutely like nobody's perfect. And it's all about like how can we maximize the good aspects of us or the strong aspects of us and minimize the things that we aren't so good at, right?
Yes. And just to plug real quickly, coaching, that is actually what coaching is. It's basically strength based, and it's really focusing on your strength. And so that's exactly what it could be also helpful for ADHD.
Into a coach.
Yep.
A
Exactly.
success coach.
Yes. So, you don't even need a diagnosis. You've already meditation, coaching. Yeah. On this list. It's so nice
Oh,
talking with
goodness.
you.
Well, it's so nice talking with you. I hope we get to keep in touch, and maybe we'll have you back for another segment on another related topic. This is really, really,
I would love to.
really educational. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Anita Chat podcast. If you haven't taken a minute to leave a review, I would absolutely love to hear from you. All you need to do is to search for the show, click your star rating, and type in a few words. Also, if there's a specific topic you'd like to see covered in this podcast, if you'd like me to be your coach, or if you want to just chat, feel free to send me an email or shoot me a message through my IG, which you'll find in the show notes. The show notes will also contain any links to the freebies that were referenced in this episode. Until next time, friends, it's been great chatting with you.